Hello everyone, Berserkhead here, and welcome to my series called Chichibyte, in which I take a look at a piece of DLC for Rome 2 and now Total War Attila, and tell you whether if you should buy it or not. Today I'm going to be taking a look at the Longbeards Culture Pack, which is the newest piece of DLC for Total War Attila. So let's see what the DLC adds to the game. As a culture pack, it unlocks 3 new playable factions for the game with their own unique units, buildings, traits, and so on and so forth. Now the first interesting thing about this DLC is the new chain of events called the Lay of Ebor, which is based on an old Germanic saga. What this is basically at the start of the campaign, you're gonna be given a few choices that you're gonna make every couple of turns, and based on your choices you're gonna get a different outcome. So for example, when I played my campaign as the Longbeards, based on the choices that I made, I got a general named Ebor who seemed to be a very promising general, and I married him to my daughter. And now let's take a look at the faction traits. First of all, we start with the Burgundians, who have plus 10 unit replenishment and plus 15 food for every region with per fertility. I didn't play much of the Burgundians simply because I didn't find them as interesting as the other two factions, but these faction traits are actually very good. First of all, they start in a region with very poor fertility. Pretty much all the regions to the north have poor fertility. The more south you go, the more fertility you have. At least that's what I found out about the campaign. So this plus 15 food for every region with poor fertility seems like a pretty useful trait, especially early on in the campaign. Plus 10 unit replenishment, that's pretty much self-explanatory. It's a very useful trait however you want to look at it. The Burgundians start as a very poor faction. They don't really have much money. What I've noticed about their campaign is that you gotta expand as quickly as possible, and this plus 10% unit replenishment can actually work wonders for you in the campaign. Then we take a look at the elements, who have 15% increased melee attack versus Romans and plus 50% of general's radius of influence in battle. Now the first trait is very useful, and I'm gonna explain why a little bit when I talk about the factions in the campaign. And when it comes to the second one, I personally don't find it that useful, but it's still a pretty interesting faction trait, which makes the faction kind of unique. Then we take a look at the Longbeards, who have the number of men recruited from defeated enemies' forces each doubled. So basically, when you defeat an enemy army and you decide to take the volunteers from the enemy army into your army, you get double the amount of what you would get playing as any other faction. They also have plus 10 unit morale when fighting armies of other religions, kind of similar to the one of the traits of the elements, but this time it's not just fighting against Romans, it's fighting armies of other religions, which early on in the campaign is not going to be very useful, but once you actually expand, that's going to be a very useful faction trait. Also, as in any other culture pack, the factions are going to get their own unique chain of missions that they're going to be able to do throughout the campaign. And now let's take a look at the unique units for each faction. This DLC adds a lot of new unique units, so if multiplayer is your thing, this DLC might actually be a worthy purchase. First of all, you have the Burgundians with 9 unique units, which makes them the faction with the most units out of all the 3 factions. The Elements and the Longbeards have 7 unique units each. When it comes to the unique buildings, the Burgundians have a new building chain including 3 buildings. The Elements have a new building chain including 4 buildings plus a level 5 upgrade to the Hall of Elders, which is another unique building for them. The Longbeards have a new building chain including 2 buildings plus 2 more unique buildings for their faction. When it comes to the ancillaries, there are 4 new ancillaries, which each faction of this culture pack has access to. The faction that I find the most interesting is the Longbeards. I actually advanced in my campaign quite a lot as the Longbeards. That's the faction that I've been playing the most of. What I find interesting about them is that they have a certain amount of charisma based on the way they look and based on their faction traits and starting location and all of that. I just find them to be very interesting. The campaign is probably the least challenging of all 3, but that gives you a lot of room to work with. What I decided to go for personally is I decided to go for a Germanic expansion and kind of unite all the Germanic pagan territories and then go for the Western Roman Empire, which I haven't gotten around to yet, but I will at one point, because I will keep playing the campaign as this faction since I find it very interesting. The second faction that I tried out were the Elements, and even though their starting location is very similar to the one of the Longbeards, it is actually just different enough to make you play the campaign in a very different way. These factions may seem similar at first, but if you actually try and play as them, you'll find out that they're very different from each other. As the Elements, the first threat you gotta deal with are the Vandals. They're gonna be retrogrades pretty much straight away. The first few turns they might attack you, so early on it's good that you have higher income than the other two factions, so you can actually build an army for yourself to defend your settlement from the Vandal hordes. And then after you deal with that, the best room for expansion is the Western Roman Empire, which you can attack. You can still go for a Germanic expansion, but given your faction traits and the mission that you're gonna receive, that's actually the better way of doing things. Once again, I find the campaign as the elements very interesting. They once again have a unique feeling to them, and the campaign is very challenging. When it comes to the Burgundians, I didn't find their campaign that interesting, and that's why I didn't play as them too much. They're mostly what I would call a multiplayer faction simply because of the units that they have. When it comes to the campaign, you start as a very poor faction with just one settlement, very low income, very low fertility, everything's very low, so you basically gotta go for expansion as soon as possible. And you have some pretty good units, so you have that going for you, but personally they are not my type of faction. And now, the moment of truth. Should you buy this DLC? I'm gonna say yes. And before you write your angry comments, let me explain my choice. For all the newcomers to my channel and people that haven't watched my previous videos, I do not condone SEGA's DLC practices. That's why I started this series in the first place. That's why I try and distinguish the bad DLC from the good DLC. And I think I did a pretty good job of that for Rome 2. We saw cases of both good and bad DLC for Rome 2, and I think I did a pretty good job distinguishing between the two. This DLC was supposed to be released about 2 weeks earlier than it actually was released, but they changed the release date based on the extremely negative response from the community, which is a step in the right direction. Have in mind that if the DLC was released when it was supposed to release, I would have said a no straight away. But they waited, they worked on the DLC a little bit more, they put a bit more effort into it, and now it's actually a decent piece of DLC, and that's why I say yes. First of all, listening to the community is once again a step in the right direction, and the DLC is not that bad. It actually adds a lot more units. I don't think there is a DLC in Rome 2 that adds that many, and the factions are very interesting. Once again, I enjoyed my experience with at least 2 of them, and there are people that are gonna enjoy their experience with all of them. So that's why I think this DLC is good. First of all, listening to the community, I appreciate that, and second of all, it's just a good piece of DLC. Once again, these factions should have been in the game in the first place, but facts are facts, and they're released as a DLC. So might as well see which ones are the good ones and which ones are the bad ones, and spotlight the good ones. So yeah, that's gonna be everything for this video. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.